I think they're deliberately not putting us right next to each other because then it would be obvious how stubby my legs are. But thanks for joining us, guys, and happy publication day.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about sprints today. And just so we get a sense of the audience, has anyone in this audience participated in a 5-day or otherwise sort of limited sprint? All right, so you've got completely
That's just a fresh audience. Yes. You guys can't wait until you experience it.
All right, well, so, we'll start with something basic. And we can talk a little bit more about the time span, but, in 5 days, why a 5-day sprint? And I guess more just, why is a really brief, intense sprint a good idea?
Well, this dates back to when my son was born 12 years ago, and I kind of freaked out about work. I wanted to make good use of my time at the office, and since then, I've kind of been on a quest to make time efficient. I experimented a lot with team processes at Google, and I found that 5 days, you could get all the way through building a prototype. And when I came to Google Ventures, we figured out how to put a test at the end. So you actually put it in front of customers, test it, and learn. And 5 days is the least amount of time you can do all that.
I guess also, so stepping back from that, why even, because in some ways, and we can talk a little bit more about the process, but it is this whole idea of you're really setting a lot of other things aside. You're really focusing on this one thing for a limited period of time. Why in general is that a good idea?
Yeah, every business that we've worked with and the teams that we talk to, they all have these sort of big looming issues or big questions. And they're kind of things that you sort of feel around the office sometimes. Everyone's worried about how are we going to fix this or solve that. But it's hard to really dig in and sort of get your hands around those challenges. So the sprint is kind of, in many ways, an excuse to say, hey, this is the thing that we all know we should be focused on. So let's actually focus on it. Let's stop just sending emails and having meetings about meetings, and let's actually spend 5 uninterrupted days trying to solve this big problem.
That actually reminds me of one of my favorite parts of the book, which is just this little chart, which is sort of what a normal day is structured like. And
Yeah.
meetings, email, meetings, and then this little tiny sliver that's actual work, and it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, the idea of clearing the week to just do work on one project is kind of, it's a little freaky at first. You're going to be like, what about all that stuff? What about all my email? But then you get into that schedule, and it's freeing, to just have that whole time, one thing, the most important thing. It's pretty nice.
So one of the other things you say in terms of figuring out when a sprint makes sense is this quote. One of the quotes in the book is, "The bigger the challenge, the better the sprint." So it's not, you're not supposed to pick sort of some random little website feature, but it should be a big question. Why is that?
Well, partly it's the nature of clearing that amount of time and getting the right people in the room. You want to have the decision maker on your team in the room. You want to have all the people on the team who make stuff, who are going to be key to the project. And those people, and you yourself, you probably won't clear the time unless it's super important.
But it's also a matter of the risk and the cost involved in those big challenges. So if you think about a company who's launching a new product or sort of branching out in some new direction, there's a lot of money and time and commitment that's going to go into doing that thing, and usually you don't figure out until way late in the game whether it was actually the right idea and the right strategy in the first place. So those are the times when it's most important to do that early test and to use a sprint to sort of fast forward and see, if we got to the end of this thing, what would that actually look like?
So we've been sort of talking about this on a very general level. And I know that at least, Jake, you and I talked a little bit about that. This is something that can be applied very, very broadly, not just to startups. But just so it feels a little bit more specific, you include this example about this robotics company, Savio, which did a sprint. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what they were testing and what their process was?
Yeah, let's talk through that. So, briefly, when we started doing sprints, we were doing it for software. I'd worked on Gmail for years, John worked on YouTube, and we had the kind of experience of building things in software. You can prototype software and test it. It's pretty straightforward. This company comes along, they make a hotel delivery robot. And their question was, should the robot have a personality? Should it have, should it have a face? Should it have sound effects? How should it behave when it runs into people? And so we wanted to try to test that in the sprint process. And we thought, we're going to have to see if we could figure out how to prototype it. And they came in with a bunch of ideas, but they were worried that the robot, if it had personality, might overpromise. We're all sort of spoiled by Wall-E and C-3PO, and we think that robots are more capable than they actually are. And the thought was, if you put the robot out there, it looks like it can talk to you or something. then people might be frustrated, they might be disappointed with their robot interaction.
And it also kind of looks like R2-D2.
It also does, right? It's about R2-D2 height. So the robot, the way it works, you put a toothbrush or something in this little hatch at the front desk, and then the robot will drive on its own to the room and make the delivery. So yeah, throughout the course of the sprint, we talked about all these ideas that the company had. We cooked up some others. John suggested the idea of the robot doing a little dance. And in order to build that prototype, the company had a robot, but we basically had to modify it, kind of hack it. So normally the robot drives on its own. For the purposes of the test on Friday, they did sort of remote control with like a PlayStation remote. We took like an iPad mini and put it on the face of the robot so it would look like a face. And just for that one interaction of delivering a toothbrush at the hotel room door for 5 customers, it worked.
The big lesson from that sprint was that the teams who are running sprints to solve these problems, they generally already have the skills. They have the expertise that they need. So, it's crazy for us to design a robot, but this is a robotics company. They know how to design robots. The sprint process was just sort of giving them a better way to approach that big problem.
So I think that's actually a good transition to maybe talking a little bit more about prototyping, because you guys actually in the book, you break it down into a 5-day process. We won't go into all of that. Go ahead and read the book, guys. But one of the things that certainly for me, like when you hear that, you think, okay, it's probably like 1 day where you're like brainstorming or whatever, and then 4 days where you're actually building the prototype. But in fact, you guys have 1 day for the prototype, and not only that, but most of the days are actually just 6 hours of working time. So it's basically 6 hours to build a prototype. How is that achieved?
Yeah, so when I first started doing the sprints at Google, I did exactly what you described. 1 day of coming up with ideas and then 4 days of prototyping them. And over time, I realized that if you spent more time making decisions up front and planning and making sure you had sort of set aside like, this is what should happen in this part of the prototype, this is what should happen here, you could actually prototype much more, much faster. So by spending 3 days sort of getting your plan in order, on that 4th day when you prototype, you can fly and you can make it super real, super fast.
Yeah, we also don't want people spending too much time on the prototype, because the more time you spend, the more attached you get to the ideas. So, it's frequently the case that on Friday's test, not all of it works well. Some ideas are good, some things need a little bit more refinement, and if you've spent a week building a prototype, then you might be more inclined to say, oh, what do those customers know anyway? Like, let's just go ahead and build it.
And Savvy Oak, was sort of one of the positive examples. One of the things you also do in the book, sort of with some of the incriminating information removed, you do talk about some of the failures or the sprints that didn't quite have the desired outcome. When you look at that, what do you think are some of the common elements that lead to it not being successful?
A lot of the most common problems with sprints are about the team, and specifically not getting the right team. So some of our early sprints, we didn't include the true decision maker. So every project, every team has a decision maker, and teams are more or less honest about how those decisions are made. Some teams like to be very collaborative and sort of consensus driven, but there might actually be somebody kind of behind the scenes making the decisions. And if we sort of left those people out of the sprint, we found that in some cases we would come up with something during the week that seemed great, that tested great, but when it got back to sort of production, kind of everyday work, it didn't it never sort of took hold. It never really saw its way to an actual finished product.
That decider was kind of like, well, it's not exactly what what I think sort of the vision for our product should be, or it doesn't match what I think we should be prioritizing. But when that person's in the room, it's amazing. Everything is sort of perfectly aligned.
And that is interesting, because you do talk about this idea of, because I guess in my head, I think especially with the startups you work with, usually probably it's the CEO who's driving the process, but at a larger company, say at AOL, I imagine that you're probably having smaller teams, but then you've got to convince somebody higher up that they should be involved. How does that actually work?
Well, there are a few different kind of strategies that we use to convince teams or convince decision makers specifically to run sprints, and we kind of describe them in the book. Do you remember the list? I think there's 3 of them.
So one of the big ones is to say that it's an experiment. The sprint actually started as an experiment, and that's a good way to introduce it to your team, to say, hey, like, this is an experiment. Let's try this once. We'll all evaluate whether we think it's a good idea.
It's also kind of the offer of uninterrupted focus. So to be able to go to a leader, a decision maker, and say, hey, I know that this is the top priority for the company right now. I want to take a team and I want to spend an entire week on it. A lot of times that offer is sort of hard to refuse if it is truly the most important project.
Especially because the results are so fast. I mean, we'll often sort of pitch the sprint as you're going to have a prototype, like a realistic prototype, in just 1 week, and that's pretty cool. But a lot of times it also comes down to just being honest and saying, hey, I am frustrated with our pace of progress on this. I think we're spending too much time on too many different things, and let's try a sprint. Hopefully the book is also compelling. You show them, look, there's an actual book, so it must be a thing.
Right, with like real venture capitalists who
Yeah.
wrote it. And, Google, you've heard of them. So going back for 1 second to sort of, successful sprints and unsuccessful sprints. So is the desired outcome that you should have a prototype that you're going to pursue at the end of the process? I mean, if we go through a week and at the end of it you're like, wow, it turned out that actually we definitely should not have a robot with personality, is that still a good outcome?
Well, we think so. We've been in sprints, which for obvious reasons I won't name, but we've actually been in sprints where entire product concepts were sort of canceled or set aside because the sprint showed so clearly that customers didn't want it or didn't understand it or had sort of misgivings about how that product would work.
Yeah, if you zoom out for a second and think about our interest as investors, and so GV, which is formerly Google Ventures, Alphabet kind of took all our letters. But as GV, we want these startups to be as successful as possible. And we know that in order to be successful, they've got to take their business, they've got to find like the perfect product that matches what customers are really going to do in the real world. They've got to sort of make that bridge between their vision and real life. And we want them to find out as fast as possible if they're on the wrong track. And if they're on the right track but just a little bit off, we want them to be able to correct and make fast progress. So for us, the sprint kind of lets them use design to fast forward and move much, much faster on that discovery process. And we think it'll make our investments more successful.
So we've talked about software, we talked about robotics. In the book, I mean, one of the really fun examples you talk about Blue Bottle Coffee. How broadly do you think sprints can be applied? And maybe conversely, are there areas where you're like, no, this actually doesn't make sense?
Yeah, we're continually surprised by how many different kinds of projects a sprint can be appropriate for. Jake was telling me just a couple weeks ago we heard stories from people who would run sprints at a church and sprints in a high school class studying literature. So there's some really interesting examples like that. But I think even within the companies that we work with at GV, there's just a huge range of different kinds of teams. A lot of the examples that are in the book and some of our favorite sprints are with healthcare companies, which is, in terms of sort of applying design to solve problems, it's kind of, it's relatively undeveloped. Not a lot of healthcare companies are in the habit of using design. And so those are really exciting, really rewarding projects. We've worked on a lot of sort of very technical enterprise type software products. There was actually a sprint that we worked on last week that involved taking data and photographs from satellites and using computer vision to analyze those photographs to sort of collect economic data. So really huge range of different kinds of projects.
Did you use a sprint to write this book?
We used elements of the sprint, and actually the sprint book started with a prototype, a realistic prototype. So I took a week and made a jacket for the book, which was terrible, but looked like plausibly it could be a book, and made sort of the first 20 pages, not the real 21st pages of the book, but realistic enough that I could show it to people and get reactions. And that's the heart of the idea. You get real faster than you think you should. And then you start to see how people react, and it helps you too. The data is interesting, but it's also helpful to see that real prototype.
Let's talk a little bit about GV, just because I know that the exact relationship between GV and Google can be a little bit confusing sometimes. Do you want to just talk a little bit? What is your relationship to Google, and then now to the larger, I guess, Alphabet company?
Well, it's a lot simpler now with Alphabet because we have a way to sort of describe what goes on, which is that we're one of the separate companies. So there's Google, obviously, and if most folks have heard of Google, but GV now is one of the separate companies, and Alphabet's sort of a holding company. So there's X, which is the self-driving car. That's another one of the separate companies. Calico. So there's a few of them kind of at that little nest, and so we are not making investments with the idea of how can we help Google. We're just making investments with the idea of building great technology and making a return on those investments.
So there's still like lots of unclaimed areas of the alphabet that Alphabet will be launching in the future.
Yeah, I mean there's 26 letters, so we only have 2. I think it's 24 to go.
But you guys, also it's not. Obviously like Google and GV. It's not like that's necessarily the guiding force in where the company goes next. I think that in terms of GV, to a certain extent, you guys, it's not the only thing you guys are associated, but part of the reason for doing this book is, you guys sort of, to a certain extent, originated this concept and have kind of, talk about working with your startups about it, on it. Is this something that, how do those conversations come about? How hard do you push to say, no, this is really what makes sense now versus other people who think, this is a terrible idea, we want to take your money, but we don't want to do this weird sprint stuff?
We don't push. That's the short answer. We're basically available as a resource to the companies that we invest in, and GV is invested in over 300 companies. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't work with all of those companies. But the way that it sort of goes down is that we're constantly in communication. So every week we meet up for office hours and we're answering emails. We're sort of trying to stay in touch with as many of those companies as possible. And together we look for these really big opportunities or these big problems. So we look for when a team is talking about launching something new and being not quite sure how it's gonna work, or when they talk about a hunch that they have or sort of a pet idea for making something better, we sort of look for those opportunities and then we say, okay, this would make for a great sprint. We get the band together, we pick a date, and we do it.
Part of the thing that's interesting about it is that John and I are designers, and I think there's often a perception about design that it's this sort of special, magical, creative thing that those kooky guys do, and it's like down in Professor Snape's dungeon, kind of a weird thing. And what happens with the sprint is that companies come in and they have a business question, or an opportunity, and through the course of the sprint, what we're doing is trying to take the elements of design, which are really just about problem solving, and make them accessible. And so during the course of the sprint, we will not only try to help a company solve that problem, and like John said earlier, those solutions end up coming from them. We don't know how to build robots, but they do. But also teach them how to approach a problem in the way a designer would. So learning more about the customers, trying things out really quickly, and seeing what works and what doesn't, and sort of learning by making. And all those things, they often start from a conversation that's about a business question, and then it all sort of comes together in the sprint.
It does seem like, we're at this point where more and more startups are talking about design, and then I think you sometimes see some backlash against this where people say, oh, you're just like fetishizing design, and then also no one can quite agree on what is and what isn't design. From your perspective, do you feel like that's something that's a fairly clear-cut issue, or do you guys sort of take a kind of agnostic view on it?
Well, I think it's clear to us. I think on our team, I think we tend to agree, and we have a pretty clear sense of what it means. And I think that we feel like design is just it's a method and it's a process for solving problems. And it's oftentimes it's used to solve certain types of visual problems, and that's where design kind of gets into this this role where it's not sort of operating at the core of the business.
But just like arguing about fonts or something like that.
Yeah, but one of the things that really inspired us to write this book is that there has been this conversation about design should have a more strategic role at companies of all kinds. But a lot of the people who were sort of having that conversation or arguing for that role, that seat at the table, as it's sometimes called, we're lacking kind of a cookbook or a recipe or a guidebook for exactly how to do that. And Sprint, I don't think we don't think it's like all inclusive. It doesn't apply to every single problem in every single situation, but we think it's a really useful, really concrete way of taking everything that's good about design, the techniques, the tools, the processes, and applying those to basically any kind of big, important business problem.
Great. So we're going to open it up for questions in just 1 second, so start thinking about what you want to ask. I guess last question on design, is there any particular reason why you think so much of the conversation about design is happening now, and it seems like we're just hearing about it more on the startup side?
Well, I think it's as products become more sophisticated, and there's a natural rising expectation in how well they'll fit into our lives. We have software in our daily lives, and for hours every day. When I was growing up, it was like half an hour on like a black and green screen. It was
That was like you went over and switched on the computer and waited 15 minutes while it booted up.
yeah.
Put in a floppy.
Put in a floppy disk, yeah. So we're really making ourselves sound awesome right now, but it's everywhere now, and so naturally, as people build on things that are out there, and technology just gets better and better, our expectations rise. And I think what you're also seeing are places where design is used so well that it makes the product great. If someone's finding a way to use design, and I think a lot of times people talk about Airbnb as an example of this, taking something that might be like a very uncomfortable situation, and they've figured out how to match it right to the customer.
And the barriers have gotten lower certainly for building software products and for launching startups. One of our partners at GV, Joe Kraus, he's the founder of Excite and JotSpot, which was acquired by Google. And he has a great blog post from a few years ago where he talks about when he started Excite, they had to go and buy servers. They had to physically buy the computers, and they had to rent space in a data center, and they had to like carry them over there on the weekend and like hook them up with bolts and like plug them in. And then when he started JotSpot 10 years later, they just signed up for something on Amazon, and like they had their servers. So from a technological perspective, it's gotten, the barriers to creating products from scratch have gotten a lot lower. So that sort of leaves it to design to differentiate. When it's that much easier to create something, there's this competition not just to make it exist, but to make it really, really good.
Cool. Well, do we have questions in the audience?
Hi. What's your personal favorite sprint that you've done so far, and what are some of your current sprints that you plan on working on?
So, we talk about the robot one a lot because robots are so cool, but one of the companies that I actually get the most excited about working with is a company here in New York called Flatiron Health. And it's exciting partly because it's so hard and so important. So they're doing kind of data for cancer. They're trying to collect and organize the world's cancer data so that they can suggest better treatments when patients come in. And as you try to go through a sprint with that company, as we're working with them, we're looking at all of the intersection of different problems that exist there. So, I mean, the healthcare problem is very real, like just actually the science behind the cancer treatment that patients are getting. And then the technology problem is hard. They're trying to analyze huge amounts of data, and then they're trying to also deliver that in a clear way that'll fit into these businesses. These cancer care clinics are businesses. They have to run in a responsible way. And there's just all of these things sort of colliding and overlapping. And so, I don't mean to speak for you, John, but when we finish a sprint with Flatiron, my head is usually like hurting because it was so complicated and so hard. But then you also see where design and where this practice of problem solving and working together as a team really makes a difference. Because when you get that right, you match a patient with like the right treatment. That's amazing. And that's the stuff that makes me the most excited in our job, is when we get to work with those companies who are taking on things that are super hard, that are almost beyond what they can do, and making progress. And it's a great feeling.
Did you guys want? I think he also asked about upcoming sprints. I don't know if that's something you can talk about, but anyone want to take a stab at it?
We have a couple interesting sprints on the books. We can let's see. So I mentioned briefly that we did a sprint last week with a company who was processing satellite data. It's super interesting. We're going to actually be doing a sprint with Flatiron Health, I think, in a couple of weeks.
And I think we have another one coming up with Blue Bottle Coffee.
Oh yeah,
it's always a favorite of ours.
Yeah, we did a sprint earlier this year with Medium, which is this online publishing platform. So that was something that was like very, very near and dear to our hearts as writers.
Other questions in the audience?
Hi, I wanted to know, what is the ideal sprint size? Is it an even number or an odd number?
Oh, that's a great question. We actually have come to the conclusion that 7 is the ideal size. And I know that sounds strangely arbitrary, but it turns out that when you get many more than 7 people in the sprint, it starts to get a little unwieldy. You've got a lot of different ideas to look through when you're reviewing solutions, and you've got a lot of conversation to manage. When you have 7, you've got a bunch of diverse opinions, so you don't have too few people in the sprint, but you've also got a small enough number that you can really keep moving fast. You feel like a tight team, and that's part of what we're going for in the sprint.
Other questions?
Hey guys, are there any apps that you use every day that you can't live without? And maybe there are some that are new that people should be on that they're not on, and maybe also a couple apps that you thought were good in theory, a couple good concepts that never kind of got off the ground.
What do you think, John?
One of my favorites is it's not actually an app at all. It's a really cool service called Digit that helps people save money. So they look at you connect it to your bank account. It looks at your bank account and it studies your spending habits. So when you get paid and when you spend money, and it looks for these days when you have like a few bucks left over, right? So there's all this interesting research from behavioral economics about how if you don't have the money in your bank account, you're not going to spend it, right? People look at their balance and say, oh, I can afford this. So by sort of stealing off these little bits and putting them in a savings account for you, you can save a ton of money. It's one of our portfolio companies, so I'm a little bit biased, but I love that idea of using technology and using design to solve a really important problem that affects a lot of people. But doing it in a way that's just sort of like by helping them do something that they already want to do, helping kind of tweak and improve their behavior.
I'll tell you about one an app that's not out yet, but will be out soon, that I know you and I have both been using, called One Big Thing. And this is based on an idea that John had for sort of redesigning the to-do list. And John has this practice where he just picks one big thing he's going to do each day. He writes it down, and that's his to-do list. It's like one thing with maybe like 2 things that he might get to. And when he explained it to me, I kind of thought he was nuts. But then I tried it because he's like doing it next to me all day and looking, cheerful. And so I tried it, and it's remarkable. What happens is I'll often go through the day if I'm not doing this and have all these ideas like I'm going to do that and that and that. And then by the end of the day, like I haven't done any of them, and I've checked my mail a lot. That's a frequent pattern for me. And with One Big Thing, it's like if you don't do anything else, just get this one thing done. And it really, at the morning, start in the morning focusing on that. It's sort of transformative for the day. And it aligns with the sprint idea. You pick one thing, you clear off everything else, and your cut line is just one thing. And it's amazing what you can get done when you just focus on that most important project.
Other questions?
Keep an eye out for that. It's coming out.
Hey guys, my name is Pratik. Thanks for coming out. Big fan. So one of the things I find really interesting about what you guys have done is the concept of anxiety party. How have you integrated that with the design sprint, if you have at all? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so
First of all, explain what anxiety party is.
Sounds fun, doesn't it?
Yeah. So there are 5 of us who are design partners at GV, and we kind of are responsible for giving each other feedback about how we're doing in our jobs. And we don't really do anything formal, but at some point we realized we needed something. And the idea with the anxiety party is we've all got things that we worry about. Like, I wonder if I am doing this well enough, or if I'm doing too much of this, or I wonder if my lateness, I really have a chronic lateness problem. I wonder how much everyone hates me for that. And so the anxiety party was a way for us to bring up our anxieties and then have everyone on the team score us from 1 to 5 on how much we should worry. And then we had a conversation about it. And it's super weird sounding, but
I mean, the insight was that, and this was from our partner, Daniel. He's one of the design partners at GV. He said, when you go into a review with your boss, you go to get feedback, you'll be excited if somebody they say great job, like, I love how you did this thing and you weren't expecting it. But really what you want to know is, am I screwing up that thing up? Or you really have these things in mind that you're worried about, and you're wondering, like, am I going to get good marks on this thing I've been worried about? So the insight was, let's strip away all the other stuff, and let's give people peace of mind around that one thing that they were worried about.
So real quick, does that tie into sprint at all? Or?
It totally does. Yeah, there's 2 big ways that it ties in. So first, there's just the mechanics of how we do the anxiety party, and it's instead of having this conversation that could go on forever, we quietly write down a score, and then we go around the room and we review the score. And that's something we do in sprints a lot. It's to make a conversation that could be long and unwieldy efficient. But the other part is focusing on anxieties, things that worry you. So we start off every sprint by talking about the long-term goal. If we're optimistic, what's going to happen if everything goes really great in 6 months? And then we flip and we say, what are our anxieties? What are all the things that could trip us up from making a successful product? And it's that sort of team anxiety party that happens when you're starting off a sprint that really ensures you focus on answering those questions. And so the anxiety party for us as a team also becomes a source of questions that we should answer.
Yeah, an anxiety or a question that you have in a sprint might be, will customers think the price is too high, right? And you could worry about that, and you could make spreadsheets and do market research and try to figure it out. Or you could put the price on a web page and put it in front of a customer and see how they react. And that's the sort of thing we do all the time in a sprint. And when you have those big questions, the sprint is a great way to sort of answer them very quickly rather than waiting to find out.
Cool. I think we have time for one last question. I think that is you.
How are you guys? My name's Chris. I'm a product manager with AOL, and we actually practice Agile. Can you explain, if 7 is the ideal number, can you explain the roles that are necessary that people need to take within the 7 members?
Totally. So there are a few roles that you've got to have, and then it's you kind of have some versatility with the rest. So you bring in different kinds of people. So we look for, we've got to have a facilitator. So somebody's got to be in charge of just running the schedule and saying, okay, it's time to do this activity, occasionally curtailing conversations and saying, let's move on, sort of capture that and move on. You got to have what we call the decider. So that's the decision maker, and that's the person in the room who, sometimes if it's a smaller startup, it might be the CEO. Sometimes at a bigger company, it's the PM or some other exec. And that person's in the room anytime there's a tough decision, so that you don't try to come to consensus or whatever, they just make the call. For the rest of the team, we want diversity. So we want people who have different opinions, different perspectives, different expertise. And it's great to have people who are going to be actually on the team building the product. We want them in the room. We want, if you're building software, for instance, you obviously want an engineer, a PM, a designer. But it's also really helpful to have a marketing person or a person who does customer support, someone who's got expertise in how your customers really use the product, just different parts of the business, because those different perspectives end up bringing solutions and inspiration into the sprint that's often surprising and often yields the strongest results.
I have nothing to add.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Sprint on sale in the back of the room. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.